What you have to understand about Canada is we are literally a narco state. Our government is not a government any longer. Our government is a criminal organization. Trudeau is penetrated by Klaus Schwab's cabinet already.
Yeah.
So first of all, can I ask the dummy that you were arguing with yesterday, what was his original point? Because I came in halfway through it.
I think he was trying to say that Trump should hold off on any sort of tariffs for 6 months until the conservatives win the election in Canada. That was originally what he seemed to be saying. He then sort of morphed that into, but it doesn't matter because conservatives will win anyways, and actually the tariffs won't hurt Canada. They'll only hurt the United States, so he's just trying to encourage us not to do tariffs to save ourselves, because if Canada wanted, they could stream down to Washington, D.C. and overthrow the White House again, and Canada literally has every resource they'd ever need, so they don't need the United States as a trading partner.
With our 64,000 troops, that only half of them are viable for combat?
Yeah, I don't know. I think he was just someone that was emotional. I think that there is an argument to be had that Trump's strong position on tariffs in Canada is harming the Conservative Party there. And I think the Conservative Party probably was most likely to cruise to an election victory. And now that's in doubt. And I do think there's an argument to be had. I just don't care. For me, the better argument is, should these tariffs be occurring anyways? Like, for the sake of fairness, is it true that, as Trump's saying, that Canada's been taking advantage of the United States with tariffs and now we're going to fight back? If that's true, then we should fight back in the United States. If it's not true, then we shouldn't. But the timing of the Canadian elections doesn't factor in. That's all I was trying to say.
Okay, well, first of all, it is ruining the Conservatives' chances of getting elected, but that's not Trump's fault. That's because Pierre is mimicking liberal talking points and is, I got to stand up to Orange Man bad, whereas before he pretty much had all the same talking points as Trump. But once Trump got into office, something changed and he's a whole different person now, which is losing a ton of his base, because he's trying to cater to the retarded liberals who are just left of center, and that has lost the Conservatives the last 2 general elections. So that's his own fault.
Now, I sort of agree with you, but I always want to say Poilievre, but I can't pronounce it. It's
Poilievre.
Poilievre, okay. Right. I do sympathize with him a little, because on one hand,
I don't.
For me, as an outsider, you tell me if I'm wrong. You're Canadian, correct? So you tell me if I'm wrong. As an outsider, one of the perspectives I get from Canadians is that they're in a similar position to how we feel in the United States, where we feel like the government that was in charge for years doesn't give a shit about the native population and citizens of the country. So in the United States, we feel like Biden cares about Ukraine. Biden cares about illegal immigrants. Biden cares about sending money all over the world, but he don't give a shit when people suffer a hurricane in North Carolina. He doesn't give a shit when there's fires in California. He doesn't give a shit when there's fires in Hawaii.
Fires in Jasper.
Right. And so I sympathize, where I'm like, I feel that's how a lot of Canadians feel. It's like, well, we're importing people that culturally don't really share our values at huge numbers, and they're sort of overwhelming certain areas in our cities, and we're more concerned with that sort of virtue signaling and all sorts of issues than actually, like, building up the infrastructure of our country and doing good for the people of this country. And I think that that's a fair criticism, again, from an outsider looking at Trudeau. The reason this makes it difficult is because Trudeau, and now, what's the new guy that took over?
Mark's Carney.
Mark's Carney, that's it. I can find Marky.
His actual name is Mark, but we call him Marks for
there we go. Okay,
obvious reasons.
Right. It allows them to be sort of nationalist, right? I don't think they care about the Canadian people, but they get to protect. They get to protect you now. Right, because
they've already
now
stated that we're a post-national state.
Well, right,
we have no identity.
Now, nationalism previous, when the United States leadership's buddy with Biden with Trudeau, and I would label it as globalist, nationalism would be going against that globalism. Nationalism now could be interpreted in Canada as sticking up against the bully, the United States. So the United
That's what
States is
it's
more
always been.
populist, conservative now, and so you could still adapt that globalist Trudeau perspective, but be seen as caring about the Canadian people and nationalists, because no matter what, the average Canadian person is going to be like, yeah, we don't like Trump talking smack on us. We don't like Trump tariffing us. And so now look, the people in positions of power is sticking up for us. Maybe we had it wrong. Maybe they are nationalists. So I do
Sure,
sympathize with
but
Poilievre about that, because it's like, well, he's in a tight spot, because if he just says, yeah, Trump has a point, then he looks weak. And the Canadians are like, wait, I thought you were big Canada first guy. And so it's a
but
very fine line to run for him, I think.
he doesn't have to like agree with Trump on anything, though. The thing that is specifically losing him the votes is that we have to stand up to Trump. We have to stand up against America. America are now our enemies, which is not what the actual conservative Canadian base wants. We want to stand with America because we know that America is heading into a period where they're trying to prosper, and Canada has every single resource available to help that prosperity. All we had to do was shut the fuck up and ride coattails. That's literally it. But all like he's going out there and just mimicking, like literally mimicking liberal talking
Well,
points.
I do think you're right about that. He needs to do a better job differentiating himself from the liberals. That I agree with. But I'm not so sure if he would have just came and been like, yeah, I stand with Trump. I don't know.
He didn't have to say that. That's what I'm saying. He never even had to mention Trump. All he had to do was continue saying what he was already saying, which was in line with where America wants to go.
But you don't think that the Canadian people would have been like, pretty much the biggest story in our world right now is Trump saying we're going to make Canada a state and putting tariffs on us? Do you have an opinion on that as likely the next prime minister? Like, he's going to have an answer. And his answer is either it's going to be some form, like there's basically three options.
The answer is fix the fucking border. That is the only viable answer.
You could say that, right? That's one possibility. But to sort of defend him a little, Trump hasn't really talked about exactly what he's looking for. I talked that guy that just came in to do the sound check, Green Cloak. Like I talked to him yesterday about this. I feel like if Trump would have just said, we're looking for this $50 billion of investment in border security, which will take the form of increased Canadian police or military presence on the border, increased inspections, a decrease from imports from China, and then it would allow someone like Poilievre to be like, yeah, we'll do that. Right. But instead, Trump's just like, well, you got to do something. And they're like, oh,
because
okay.
Trump is testing us. Like, Trump is playing like a 5D game of chess with us. He's testing us. Like, he keeps on saying that he's going to put on tariffs and then says he's not going to, and keeps on like pushing them further in the future. Right. But that's because every time he does that, he's exposing both parties exactly for what they are, for being the same fucking party.
Well, that could be true. I think that, like, again, I find myself in a weird position as a Trump supporter, sort of criticizing Trump a little here. I think what Trump wants more than anything is genuflection. I think Trump wanted Trudeau to be like, yeah, man, we'll work with you. You're right. We need to do something. Or wanted Pierre to do the same. Right?
Well, they should have.
Okay, but how well does that play with the Canadian base if there's an election incoming?
Okay. Since the 80s, we have known every single government, starting with a conservative government, which is the party that Pierre is the leader of currently, they have been told by the RCMP and CSIS, which is our Canadian Intelligence Service,
right, yep,
that the government has been infiltrated by Chinese diplomats.
You're right. Yep.
And every one of them has just pushed it aside. We literally have like Toronto Dominion Bank, which is one of our biggest banks, was fined $3 billion because they were laundering illegal money for the Chinese elites. They got fined $3 billion. Not a single person went to jail. And the governor of the TD Bank at that point was the person who is very high up in Mark Carney's Brookfield Management company that he literally just moved to New York out of Canada after he announced he was going for prime minister.
Well, yeah, you're right. Carney just moved back to Canada, correct?
Well, yeah, after 20 years of
Right.
not being Canadian and identifying as a European
And
because
now
he
he's
has
the
three
big dog.
fucking
Yeah,
passports.
I think you're right on this point. I think that ultimately the fentanyl conversation actually has a
Is
lot to do with
serious.
China,
Like,
right? And so, like, yes, you could look at the volume of fentanyl, and certainly it's coming, like, I think 10 times more, if not greater, from Mexico than Canada. But the
no, it's not.
problem's the same to Trump. The
It,
problem is in
it,
both of these countries, Canada's running roughshod and has tentacles all through the government, and they're basically allowed to do what they want. And so we want some sort of signal that that shit's going to stop. Right. And I think that it certainly does have literal to do with fentanyl and border crossing and things like that. But I think there's a
mostly.
secondary goal there, which is sort of we're setting up people to be like, look, you're with us or you're with China. Or that's what Trump's
Well,
doing. And so he
well,
wants
yeah.
sort of a symbol of like, you're going to deal with what we, because I think you see that battle that's going to be upcoming in the United States as well. You're going to start to see a push for starting, not allowing Canadian nationals to do things like buy farmland and investigating, possibly charging and getting rid of Canadian influence in our academic spheres. So I think that certainly you're right that that's a big part of what he's saying without directly saying to Canada and Mexico. I would like more clarity. This is just me reading the tea leaves and assuming what's going on. Given
You're
that,
asking
if
him
Pierre
to get
came
to
out
a
and was
part.
like, got in the phone with Trump and was like, here's the deal, man. We are totally prepared. We totally agree with you, right? We're totally prepared to help with that. I think that Trump probably would have came out and said like, hey, Pierre's willing to work with this, and we think he'll be a fantastic PM and he's going to be great for the United States and he's going to be great for Canada. And that probably does a lot to help Pierre. But instead, Pierre, I think sort of maybe it's because he's going to be more of the same as Trudeau. And it's very similar to the old left side of the coin, right side of the coin here in the United States, Republican and Democrat, where it's like Labor's going to be, or that the Conservatives are going to be very similar to Trudeau's Liberals. Just like in the UK, the Tories and Labor, right? Where they're supposedly complete opposites, but what's really the difference? So maybe that's the truth. I mean, do you think Pierre's shitty, that he's really just like a globalist that's just
Yes.
you? Okay, maybe that's the
Well,
case.
okay.
I don't know.
He's not necessarily, well, before he was spurging against the WEF and saying that anybody who was affiliated with the WEF wouldn't be allowed in the Canadian government. But it was fucking Harper in the last, like our last conservative leader just before Justin Trudeau, who made a free trade agreement with China, who has upped tariffs on us in the meantime since Trump has been saying he will and hasn't.
Yeah,
China has
that's correct.
increased tariffs on us and nobody fucking cares because
Well,
we're willing to give money to China.
it does seem odd that you haven't seen as vocal of press conferences from Canadian politicians in response to China's tariffs. Now, let me say this. Maybe in America, I wouldn't see that. Maybe the news is curated to me in such a way that I'm only paying attention or seeing things that are America focused. But would you say that that's also true in Canada, that you haven't seen politicians speak up as aggressively against China's
Not a single
increased
one.
tariffs?
Not a single one has even mentioned that China has increased tariffs on us since we increased tariffs on their EVs to appease you guys, apparently to appease you guys.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I mean
no,
that's certainly interesting because if it's just as I sympathize with any country in the world that everybody should have a government that's primarily for looking out for their own citizens' interests first and foremost. That doesn't mean that you want a government that's like, we're going to attack our neighbors and take all their resources. But I would expect the government of the United States to be looking out for, first and foremost, for the people of the United States, and the government of Canada to be looking out for Canadians, and the government of Mexico to be looking out for Mexicans, and so on and so forth. And I think that one of the struggles living in the Western world is oftentimes what you find is all of the leaders together are sort of globalist and they don't give a shit about the populations of their own country. And so you'll see these sort of, populist movements that'll spring up, but most of them are sort of cut down, like in Romania. Well, George Gasco, sorry, dude, you're under arrest and you can't run for president and the election didn't count. Oh, and by the way, we're now going to censor disinformation online so people can't even bitch about the fact that we just canceled the election. Like, that's the sort of stuff that occurs. Or you get the two puppet syndrome where it's like, oh, we got this globalist and it's massively unpopular with like Trudeau. So then you got this guy that comes up against him, Pierre. But on the important things, it's going to be more the same. And so for
Exactly
me,
the
if
same.
someone, the way I would be looking at and saying, well, how would I evaluate if someone's really Canadian first that's running for office? And when it came to the topic of tariffs, I would say, well, they're bitching about tariffs against their country, right? Whether those tariffs come from the United States or from Mexico or from China. So if I see someone that's only complaining about tariffs from the United States, but not
Which
China,
haven't even been implemented yet.
right, that would lead me to believe, well, maybe this guy, maybe it's not about protecting Canadian people. Maybe it's about some other agenda. Because if it's just about protecting the Canadian people, then certainly Canada or China's tariffs that seem to be more significant and already have gone into effect, you would expect there to be a lot of complaining about it. A lot of, hey, this is what we're going to do in retaliation. So again, though, I have to take you at your word. I can't confirm that you're correct or incorrect because I don't live in Canada. All I can say is from my end, I haven't heard Pierre or anyone else speak up about China's tariffs. I've seen people like you. I've seen individuals on places in social media saying, hey, what's up with this shit? I'm in Canada and China just raised these tariffs. How come our politicians aren't talking about it? But I haven't heard any of the politicians talking about it.
But if somebody said that, like, I think it was ML who said that we voted for. First of all, we might maybe have voted for Trudeau the first time, maybe. But the last two times is quite indicative that there was serious Chinese interference in both elections. But even still, this last Liberal race for Mark Carney that just finished, nobody knew who he was. He didn't even live in Canada. He was over ruining the UK before he came here. But once he came, everybody coalesced behind him. They first said that they were going to allow anybody who was 14, and they didn't even have to be Canadian, sign up to vote. And then they changed that. They disqualified two different candidates for no good reason that they've actually given us because the internet was rallying behind them. And then out of the 400,000 Liberals who were registered, they only allowed 150,000 of those votes. And Mark Carney won with an 85% win rate across every single riding, including the ones that the other Liberals who are members of parliament, because Mark Carney's not a member of parliament. Even if he wins prime minister, or when he becomes prime minister, he can't enter the House legally because he doesn't have a seat.
Well,
in the other ridings for the other Liberals, he still won at an 85% rate, which is not correct.
The other thing to say, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I don't have the specific details in what you're talking about here, but in general, like, okay, so did the United States deserve everything they got that was shit under Biden or under Obama? Right? Like the argument, well, hey, you voted for it, so you get it. It's like, well, you have to remember, oftentimes it's not that simple, right? Oftentimes there could be things, whether it be straight up cheating, or it could be huge amounts of money that are put into races to convince people one way or the other. Yeah, in general, I think the same is probably true as it is in Canada as it is the United States, which is a lot of people don't inform themselves and they end up not seeing how bad the situation is until it's too late. I know awesome people in my life. They're some of the greatest people I've ever met, some of the hardest working people. They didn't give two shits about politics. They just didn't care. They basically just wanted to be left alone. And when I would talk about politics to them, when we'd be out at the bar or just hanging out at a cookout or something like that, I don't really want to hear Rob. Till COVID hit. Then all of a sudden when they were told, hey, you can't go see your mom in the nursing home, you can't go to work, you're non-essential. Holy shit, now they cared. They cared now. Now all of a sudden voting was a big deal. Politics was a big deal. No, I would have never deigned to have been like, well, you guys deserve it. It's a good thing you can't see your mom. You deserve it. You voted for Tom Wolf in Pennsylvania, our governor. You deserve it. It's like, okay, people realize it's a mistake now. So yeah, on one hand, there is part of saying like, if people vote for this shit, but on the other hand, how many people say that and will acknowledge, well, in our country, the elections were bullshit. I think the 2020 election was fraudulent, but I assume the Canadian election was legit. There was nothing going on there. So I don't, that's not a criticism that I make usually. Well, you deserve it because you voted this way,
We know for a fact that in one of, I forget which riding it was, but it was around Toronto, one of the ridings, there was a man named Han Dong who was a Liberal, who was going for the seat. And we know for a fact that they were busing in Chinese students from other ridings to vote for him. So that, like, we know for that's part of why Trudeau prorogued the government before he stepped down, because once you prorogue the government, any investigations get immediately shut down, which is the same reason that he did it the last time when he prorogued the government and called a snap election, because we were letting Chinese officials or Chinese people who we knew were affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party. We gave them the highest level of security clearance in our most protected virology lab in Winnipeg, and they took viruses like Ebola and others back to China and gave them away. And then we didn't prosecute them, and now they're in China and we can't do anything about it. Not that they would anyway, but that's when he prorogued government last time and called a snap election before the investigation got out.
Is there a conservative, or even, I guess, a better question, a populist government? If you think Pierre sucks, is there any, like, politicians of any sort of national recognition whatsoever that you would recommend? Obviously, probably at this point, I don't think any of them would have a chance to win this upcoming election. But is there any hope that there's, like, some sort of political movement that you think would be favorable to, like, the actual people of Canada?
Well, Pierre still has a chance of winning. He definitely still has a chance of winning. But the thing is, with him, like, equalization is a big problem in Canada. Like, Alberta is the only province that makes money because of gas and oil, which they want to cap so fucking badly. But Alberta is the only revenue positive province in Canada, and they send billions and billions of dollars every single year over to Quebec and Ontario and the Maritimes. Saskatchewan is basically falls even. And BC, every other province, and none of them have said that they are willing to address equalization. Like, out of Canada, the prairies are resource provinces for the elites in Ontario and Quebec. And we have a weird thing where Quebec has the Bloc Québécois, and they are they're a federal party, but they exist only in Quebec. But they had a very good chance of being the official opposition prior to this whole Trump thing if Pierre had won, because everybody was so disenchanted with the Liberals. But the Bloc will literally only vote yes when it is positive for Quebec. Even if it's just neutral for Quebec and benefits the rest of Canada, they will shut the vote down. They will vote no on it just because they're pricks. But so nothing will change with the equalization payments in Canada because Quebec just has too many ridings, and Ottawa will always side with Quebec because that's where a ton of their liberal votes come from. They also refuse to build pipelines. Like, during the Liberal the leadership race, Mark Carney was in fucking Kelowna in BC and said that he would build a pipeline across Canada because our crude oil from Alberta goes down to Austin or somewhere in Texas. You guys refine it and then send it back up to eastern or central and eastern Canada. So which is why the whole cutting off electricity from Doug Ford is so fucking retarded.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that was a stupid comment by him. You know, Pierre gives me vibes, and again, I see these viral clips of him. No doubt he's a talented orator. Like, sometimes when he's giving speeches or when he's handling questions from the press, it's very amusing. He's very talented of it. But the vibes I get from him are they're very similar to Boris Johnson in the UK, where Boris could light up some reporters. And he was saying things that you're like, dude, this dude's smart. He's sort of conservative. But when the rubber met the road with Boris and the Tories, when on the big issues of, like, sort of open borders for the UK, globalist bullshit, they were basically part and parcel. He could talk the talk, but then it turned out the Tories were shit. Like, all of this hampering for, like, hey, we need to get people in, protect our borders, do this, do that, you know, after labor disasters. And I feel that way with Pierre to some degree, where it's like, yeah, he certainly can talk the talk, but is he going to, like, have meaningful change? And it's really a shame too, because one thing that guy last night I was arguing with, that he has a point about, is Canada is resource rich. I mean,
Yeah.
and if you had a
Yeah.
government in Canada that was like, dude, we're going to open up our resources, we're going to manufacture and produce here as much as possible, I think the fortunes of Canadians could radically change within a generation.
We could
But
literally be the richest country in the world.
it's
Like, that is not a stretch.
it's funny because like I think Trump is trolling with Canada becoming a 51st state. And but to the extent that he wouldn't be, right? Yes, it's true that as is made up now, if you brought in Canada and it was literally one state, you would all
would
but
be horrible for
enshrine
you guys.
you would enshrine Democrats winning. But as far as long term, as far as the economic fortunes of what that would mean to the United States, that would be like 50 times bigger than the Louisiana Purchase. Like the idea of the amount of wealth and resources that Canada is actually worth if you actually use those resources properly, it's damn near unimaginable. For example, I was just reading an article today about how rich Canada is with rare earth metals. And it's like, it's funny, we're entering into these negotiations with Ukraine with these mineral deals. And the truth is, most of these minerals are in eastern Ukraine, where even if there is a ceasefire and a peace agreement, probably a lot of those regions are going to be controlled by Russia, where many of these great minerals are. But then just up north in Canada, you basically have the exact same rare earths that would be looked for. But instead of trying to negotiate a deal, maybe you could say, well, with Trudeau, you had no chance to negotiate a deal because he's shit, so they're not going to exploit it. But, you know, it just goes to show.
Trudeau was penetrated by Klaus Schwab's cabinet already.
Yeah.
But, like, okay, the thing that I was saying about Mark Carney, though, when he was in Kelowna and said that he would build pipelines across Canada, literally 2 days later, he was in Quebec and in French said that he would not build pipelines to appease Quebec. But, like, what you have to understand about Canada is we are literally a narco-state. Like, our government is not a government any longer. Our government is a criminal organization. They literally enrich themselves off of, like, we have been infiltrated by China for at least 30 years. Mostly in Vancouver, it started, whereas Vancouver has Richmond and Burnaby, which is basically Vancouver, has the largest expat population of Chinese people. And what they do is with the United National or the United something, whatever, I forget. Anyway, they have elites from China come. Like, we literally have police stations to keep the expat population in line. We have underground banks that the Chinese people, they give the money in China to criminals, and then they come here and they go to casinos or currency exchanges, and they are literally given hockey bags full of $20 bills. And then they go into the casino, they gamble for a little while, take the chips out, put them into banks, and buy property that absolutely nobody lives in. Which is what has skyrocketed our. But we also, we check like 1% of the shipments coming into Canada. Like, our ports are run by criminals. We supply about 70% of the methamphetamine to Australia. You can literally buy fentanyl off of the internet in Canada, and they tout how safe it is. And then it is delivered to you by the state-funded postal service. Like,
it's crazy.
We get the precursors to fentanyl sent here from China. We produce it, and then we distribute it to the world, and our government profits off of it. We are literally one of the most corrupt countries in the world. The only thing is, like, you say that it's worse in Mexico. It's not. You guys have more people coming in from Mexico. Like, you guys had more criminals coming in from Mexico, and you might have had a lot of drugs coming in from Mexico. But the quality, like, as in hierarchy, of people that are coming in from Canada, you're getting the kingpins coming in from Canada, which is arguably significantly worse than what's coming in from Mexico.
Well, it's
And
interesting.
because of our like trade agreements, whatever, so many of the packages don't get checked, and we're just trafficking drugs. The only thing that I can say is that we get a lot of illegal guns from you guys. The vast majority of the illegal guns in Canada come from America.
Well, I do have to get running. I said I would be done here around 9 o'clock, but I'll just say this. I think that ultimately, whatever happens with the Canadian election, I think that the tariffs won't be long term. I think that Trump will be looking for an excuse to get rid of those tariffs, particularly with Canada and Mexico, and sort of because I think he understands that even short term pain in the United States, even if it does have an ability to withstand it more than Mexico or Canada, I think he'll be looking for an excuse to get out of that. So I think that hopefully the Conservatives win in Canada and that their cooler heads prevail. And I also think that one thing that might benefit Canada is, I can't prove this, I haven't looked deeply into it, but I think a lot of the U.S. funding through places like USAID is probably going to fund a lot of this bullshit you're talking about a narco-state in Canada. And so if Doge is effective at ending that stuff, I think that it could actually help long-term in Canada as well, because a lot of that shit will no longer have funding and it'll dry up. So, but I'll give you the last word here.
I'm not sure how much that actually is, because we launder billions of dollars through Canada in a year. But honestly, I think that the tariff situation, I think that Trump originally did it to help the conservatives, to help, like, to just put the liberals on the back step so that Pierre could step up and step into the position. But Pierre ran the other way for whatever reason, because I don't think he actually wants to win. But even still, I think that like Trump going back and forth on these tariffs is just exposing, if not to Canadians, but it's confirming to him what Canada actually is. Because even during the Biden administration, when Canada intelligence would join meetings, Biden's administration would just pack up their books and leave, because they knew that Canada wasn't trustworthy.
Right.
Like, Canada is literally the position that China has taken to attack you guys in their drug war and what have you. Like, if you don't think that Trump is doing this as to protect the American people, if Canada benefits from this, great. But everything that Trump is doing with the tariffs, I wholeheartedly believe, is to secure America.
Yeah.
Because Canada is actually that dangerous right now.